I have a question or two here, but I have my own question first I wanted to ask, since I'm sort of paying for the microphones. Actually, it's the Congress, so that we all paid for the microphones. But anyway, I have them. I had a question sort of related to what Eric was saying, but maybe for you, Phil, first. You were saying that political leadership is almost more important than what the rules are. In other words, that, Castro didn't try this when Reagan and then George H.W. Bush were in charge, because presumably he knew, maybe even, you didn't mention this, but from what he did to the air traffic controllers, that he was not somebody to be trifled with. But the fact is that you're not always going to have good leadership. You're going to have weak people, or even if not weak, along what Eric was talking about, people who just don't believe in the rules. So is there some way to insulate against bad leadership, creating these vulnerabilities and opportunities for our opponents to use migration? You see what I mean?
Yeah. I think the Biden experience has taught us that maybe there is not. If Alejandro Mayorkas, as Eric put it, can say, I am basically the immigration law, it doesn't really matter what any of the laws are that we put in place if they're not followed. I mean, there was a strong case to be made. I think it's indisputable that there is an affirmative duty on the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to secure the border. It's in the statute. It's the first item. That means detaining and holding illegal migrants, and Mayorkas ignored it. So I think it is, unfortunately, we may have arrived at a point where it is not possible to rely on the statute. I know Senator's got great lawyers. The INA is a law with all kinds of complications, more complicated than tax code, but it can be ignored is what the lesson of the Biden administration was, I think.
Right. Here's a question that I thought was kind of interesting. Anybody can take this, but any ideas or any thoughts on where else we might see in the next few years weaponized migration, either coming from or who might use immigration as a weapon? And it doesn't even have to be against the United States, just sort of generally anywhere. I mean, Russia and Belarus, which is basically almost the same thing in this context, are using it. Turkey has used it. Any ideas? And maybe even, and I think I already answered the question, but why isn't it being used against, I don't know, China or India or somewhere else? So any thoughts anybody has on that?
I think the pressures in the countries, the sending countries, are still there. They haven't disappeared just because our border is secure. So in the governments, which Venezuela is a good example, who want to send maybe people that they don't want in their country to the United States, what I anticipate generally is, and this isn't probably going to happen in this administration, but the argument will be made much more frequently that these are climate refugees. And the United States is the culprit in causing climate change, and so therefore it's our responsibility to take them in.
Interesting, yeah. So in other words, in addition to sort of the persecution aspects of refugee law, that climate change could be used, or the issue of climate change could be used as a weapon against developed countries. I hadn't really thought of that. So we have a question here which you've dealt with before, Victor, but I think it'd be worth addressing. Where is it easier to defend against the use of migration? On a water border or a land border?
Definitely a land border, which is surprisingly always discussing it with Mark.
In other words, easier to defend against at a land border.
Yeah, land border, of course, yeah. Because, if you have defense, you can stop them before they reach the territory of the member states, or the state. In the sea, it's very complicated because there are other law in the sea. You are obliged to save the people who are dying, of course, which is everybody, I think it's absolutely correct and right. And
that's part of the moral asymmetry that
it's also the part of the moral asymmetry. There is an attempt now in the European context, which can be very important if it will work. At this point, it seems it doesn't work, but we'll see. There's perhaps you have heard about this Italy Albania deal, which is about the externalization of the migration crisis and the asylum procedure to stop the illegal migrant before they reach the territory. And the Italian Navy stopped the boats in international waters. This is the key issue, because if they stop them in the Italian, among the Italian borders, including the sea borders, they have to bring it to the territory of Italy. And after, it's almost impossible to get rid of people who are not eligible for any international protection. So they are trying to bring them to Albania, from international waters to Albania, to the reception centers. Now it was attacked by the activist Kurds in Rome. It's very hard to defeat them, but now we are waiting for an EU directive from the Kurds of the European Union, whether it's fit to the legal framework of the European Union, because if the Kurds says, no, it can work, then Roman Kurds can withdraw.
Yeah, well, our courts aren't all that great either, frankly. This is sort of a bigger problem, and we talked about this, is that even if you have good leadership, in other words, even if you didn't have Mayorkas, for instance, as head of DHS, you still have a kind of network of judges and NGOs and judges who used to work for NGOs and all of that who aren't presumably working for Venezuela or Russia or what have you, but nonetheless, as the Marxists would say, are objectively allied with them. So, Phil, this is kind of my gloss on a question. The asylum rules were set up after World War II, beginning of the Cold War. The point was in that context. And so it was, other than the Hungarian flight during the '56 uprising, it was a handful of people at any one time. I mean, with only a little exaggeration, it was designed for a few Russian ballerinas every year. In a sense, wasn't the Soviet Union and Communist China, to relate to your Deng Xiaoping quote, kind of allowing the West to maintain a virtuous moral stance without having to reckon with the consequences, because they weren't letting anybody out? And once people could get out, the inevitable consequences, the conflict between these asylum norms and the interests of the countries really came into the fore. So I don't know what the solution is. I'm not even sure how to state that as a question, but it's not like we want the Soviet Union back. But I mean, the fact is, they were, in a sense, cooperating with us in preventing large-scale immigration and allowing us to maintain a stance of moral purity without having to actually grapple with the consequences of it.
I think that's exactly right. And going back to the Deng Xiaoping exchange with Carter, Carter clearly had not thought through the amount of people who could come from these countries if they were in fact able to send out. As it played, the Western thinking was mushy. It gave us now a legal regime of human rights for migrants that does not function in a globalized world where largely people are motivated by economic reasons to change their countries and then to claim some kind of asylum status. When people are leaving a country as a migrant, in their head, I think back to my experience in the State Department dealing with literally thousands of these people. And, they're not sitting around in most cases thinking, I just got to be able to read the New York Times and I can't get it here, in the eastern provinces of Cuba, and that's why I'm leaving. It's always a mixture of things, people trying to make a better life. And in any case, that's going to have a huge dimension of the economics of it. How can I make a better material life for myself? So going back to your question, though, Mark, we never really got our hands, the architecture never really got their hands around it. Your ballerina example is perfect. I mean, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a great moral victory when the Soviets kicked him out and we claimed him as an example. He was able to leave the country. et cetera. The system didn't work, and he's the example of it, and we beat our chest. You know, it was good. Most anti-communists were very happy that Solzhenitsyn got out. The system was corrupt and evil, the communist system. But we have not now, going 35 years into the future, we have not got, the lesson there on the migration track is very clear. We have not got a system that can deal with the potential, the human potential to change countries, and we need to remake it.
Right. We have a question here that I think is kind of interesting, is how can immigration be a weapon at all, since according to a lot of these advocacy groups and what have you, immigration is a boon. And that kind of relates, it seems to me, something that what you were talking about, Eric, is that there are significant elements within democracies that actually see it as an opportunity rather than see migration as an opportunity and want to actually foster more of it in some sense, because, and so they don't see it as a weapon, they see it as a, you know, as a kind of, they see it almost as a tool of domestic politics to have migration come in from abroad. So that really gets to the, I don't know, I mean, you could even refer to it as a fifth column issue, in that NGOs and judges and others aren't so much doing it because they see the migration as harmful and they want to do a harm. It's because they see it as a way of getting policies within their own, getting results in their own countries that they could not get democratically. And so, I mean, I think that is sort of an instrumentalization in Victor's formulation, where it's not weaponization, using it as a, you know, to destabilize or harm the country, although it does that. They don't see it that way. They do see it as an instrument of almost domestic politics. And yeah, please, go ahead.
The one thing, and I absolutely agree with that, but what had stunned me throughout the Biden years was, and we saw this during Obama, and when it became a political liability, they dealt with it, and much more effectively. It wasn't just, you know, smoke and mirrors. But the Biden administration didn't even pretend to address any of the concerns that you raised, or the ones the American people raised. They didn't have to actually effectively do it, but they didn't have to pretend they cared, and they did not.
Right. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just a small comment what Mark asked and Eric answered. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of last year, 3.5 million refugee people under temporary protection, etc., etc. So some level of under some level of international protection lived in Germany. It was more than 4% of the population, and Germany changed the citizenship law. So after instead of 8 years, after 5 years staying, you can apply for citizenship, and among exceptional circumstances, you have job, speak relatively good German, and you have a job, you can get it after 3 years. So, and you know, these people, of course, will vote for the parties who provide them these legal frameworks. So it's, we can be naive, and it's only the example of Germany. We see a lot of different examples all around Europe. And previously, getting German citizenship was almost impossible.
And Victor, this is for you too. You were referring to Russian activities in the Sahel, in the, you know, the area south of the Sahara. It seems to me that's almost like a twofer in weaponization of migration, because they're trying to destabilize the countries themselves of Mali and Niger, what have you, and destabilize Europe by having those people, you know, illegally go to Europe. So anyway, that struck me as a sort of interesting idea, in that you get kind of double weaponization rather than just, say, Castro sending people, which you know, helps him and hurts us. We have a question here. Can the panelists address the broader question of human rights? In other words, this is the basic issue, is that authoritarian regimes are using human rights, not just laws, but the concept and the genuine sort of concern for them, as a weapon against you know, democratic countries. how do we, is there a way to square that circle, is there a way to honor human rights without basically harming ourselves? Is the concept of human rights, in a sense, a self-canceling idea, because then, you undermine the democracy itself? Anybody want to take that up? Go ahead.
Yeah, just one example, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we are speaking about authoritarian regimes, but it's the authoritarian regimes are also different. What's the level of persecution and limit of rights for their own population? Somebody's telling that Egypt is an authoritarian regime, but an average Egyptian citizens will tell, no, we are living here, yeah, there's the president, blah, blah, blah. So no any effect. And of course, it's because we insisting to our values and norms, we have to examine the asylum requests. But now the acceptance rate all around Europe for Egyptian asylum seekers below 5, 4, 3%, So we have to be realistic, and we have to tell the other 90+% that thank you for the application, it was rejected, it's high time to go home. So we don't need new legal frameworks. We know we need leadership who are ready to follow the law and telling these people, okay, it's high time to go home.
That is a difficult question. It gets to the moral asymmetry. And we talked about last night the 1951 Refugee Convention. And I know that's something you've talked a lot about. I do think, most people, almost all, I can't say all people, think that the United States has a role to play in protecting human rights and protecting those people whose human rights have been or are being violated. I think the best way to go about that is recognizing that wanting a better life for yourself in the United States is not a human right. There is no human right to migrate to the United States. And so to distinguish between what is under the UN Convention or Declaration, I should say, or what we want to establish, not the fact that you want a better life for your family, because Americans want that too. And extending that human right to everyone means no one's going to have those opportunities eventually.
Any thoughts, Bill?
I agree, obviously. We cannot, those of us, I think, in this panel and most people who seriously think it through, the international legal community very skillfully established the right to exit a country. And that was the first step, if there was indeed a plan to do this, coming out of the 1948 UN Convention on International Human Rights, et cetera. They did establish the right to exit. They did not establish, at least fully, and it's being resisted, a right to enter. So Eric is right. You do not have, in my scheme of rights, you do not have a right as a human right to enter a United States country. Although we did see this in the Biden years, a very concentrated effort in Latin America, led by our friend, the Mexican president, former Mexican president, Andres Lopez Obrador, to establish the right to migrate. And he convoked his colleagues from Cuba, from Colombia, and other countries in the region, saying there was a human right to migrate, meaning to enter another country, meaning, in effect, to enter our country. And if we do not resist that, I think we will find our country in a bad situation.
We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to address the last thing that Victor talked about, which is externalization, as they call it, which is kind of pushing the borders abroad. You were referring to the deal that Italy made with Albania to catch people to send them, which was essentially the same as our Remain in Mexico, because they still were able to apply for asylum in Europe in this case, or in Remain in Mexico, apply for asylum here, but they had to wait outside. It seems to me that, and this gets to the issue of, are there rules we can set up that make it hard even for bad leaders to undo it, is that we need, in my opinion, this is just me, we need to abolish the concept of asylum period. And as part of that, have arrangements with other countries so that if for whatever reason we don't want to return you, we send you to those other countries, which we pay, but you don't apply for asylum here, you end up there. Australia did that with Cambodia, and only 5 illegal aliens took up asylum in Cambodia, and 4 of them gave up and went back home. So it was a transparent, their asylum claims were themselves a transparent lie. And so it seems to me, ultimately, that's the direction we need to go to, not even just remain in Mexico, but what I call, what I've dubbed remain in Mongolia. So any illegal immigrant is simply sent to Mongolia if they're willing to do it. And apparently the Trump administration is, in fact, exploring with Mongolia and several other countries to this effect. And that, you know, once the word gets out, unless you really are fleeing the equivalent of Auschwitz, then you're probably not going to come. I mean, ultimately, it seems to me that's the only way, is to make clear you're not going to get in ever. And that then takes away the tool of our opponents to use migration as a weapon, because it's not going to work. It's not going to weaken us. So I want to respect everybody's time. This recording is going to be on our site at cis.org, and you can learn more about it. You can learn more about INIR at inirnet.org. And I want to thank all of the participants in the panel. Thank all of you for coming, and thanks for those who are tuning in from home.